As I speak these very words, a vast dome of high pressure is sitting squarely over the United States, and underneath it, tens of millions of Americans are baking. Roughly 80 million people are currently under some form of heat alert. Cities all the way from the Great Plains to the Midwest to the East Coast are watching their temperatures soar well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and, more dangerously still, simply refusing to cool back down again at night. It is merely one in a whole string of these heat domes to have hammered the country throughout this single summer, and it has already contributed to dozens of tragic deaths. But here, now, is the part of the story that so very often gets missed entirely. Because that heat dome, as genuinely brutal as it is really only one half of the whole picture. The other half is what happens when all of that trapped heat comes pouring down onto a city. Because our cities take that heat, and they amplify it. They turn themselves quite literally into something like great ovens. And understanding exactly why they do that is the real key to understanding one of the deadliest and one of the most quietly overlooked threats of our warming world. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to. And it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. First though, and very briefly, what actually is this heat dome that is causing all of the trouble? Well, in the simplest possible terms, it is a large and a powerful area of high pressure that parks itself directly over a region and then stubbornly refuses to budge. It acts rather like a giant lid, clamped down tightly over the atmosphere, trapping all the hot air down near the ground and blocking any cooler air from moving in to replace it. And as the air sitting beneath that lid slowly sinks downward, it compresses, and it heats up even further still. And so, day after day after day, with the summer sun beating down from above, and that great lid holding all the heat in from escaping, the temperatures simply keep on building and building. That right there is the heat dome, the vast atmospheric engine that drives the entire heat wave. And the scale of what is happening right now is genuinely staggering. The dome currently baking the country is not even the first of the summer. It is the third successive heat dome to lock over the United States in a matter of weeks, and forecasters have described it as the single most powerful heat dome anywhere on the entire planet at this moment. Out in the desert Southwest, the temperatures are running well past 110 degrees. Even Death Valley has been flirting with 126. Dozens upon dozens of daily temperature records have already fallen across the plains and the Midwest. And, most tellingly of all, hundreds of records are being broken not for the daytime highs, but for the overnight lows, the warmest nights those places have ever recorded. Across the summer's earlier domes, dozens of people have already died, and in the desert around Phoenix alone. The confirmed heat death toll for the year has been climbing steadily. This is the immediate and the deadly human backdrop to everything we're about to discuss. But the heat dome itself really only sets the stage for the disaster. The real drama and the genuine danger actually unfolds much further down, right down at street level, in the cities themselves. Because cities, it turns out, are simply not at all like the open countryside that surrounds them. On a hot day, a city can easily be several degrees hotter than the rural land just beyond its edges. And at night, the difference becomes truly dramatic. A city can remain a full 10 degrees, or even more, hotter than the countryside around it. Scientists have a name for this phenomenon. They call it the urban heat island effect. Your city, in other words, is quite literally an island of extra trapped heat, sitting in the middle of a wider sea of cooler land. And once you truly understand the reasons why, I promise that you will never quite look at a city in the summertime in the same way again. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, how hot does it get where you live in the summer, and does your street have much shade? Let me know down in the comments and where you're watching from. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. So let's start with the simple question of what a city is actually made out of. Asphalt roads, dark rooftops, concrete, brickstone now. These dark, hard, solid surfaces happen to be extraordinarily good at one particular thing, absorbing sunlight. They soak up the raw energy of the sun and they convert it directly into heat. A dark asphalt road, sitting under the full sun on a summer afternoon, can actually reach a surface temperature of well over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to genuinely burn the skin right off your hand. The open countryside, by stark contrast, is full of much lighter colored surfaces and living plants, which reflect a great deal more of the sunlight away and absorb far, far less of its heat. But here, now, is the truly insidious part of the whole thing. Because all of that concrete and brick and asphalt does not merely absorb the sun's heat during the daytime, it actually stores it away, rather like a gigantic battery. And then, all throughout the following night, it very slowly releases every bit of that stored up heat back out into the surrounding air. And this is precisely the reason that a city simply does not cool down at night the way that the open countryside reliably does. And this one thing, this fundamental failure of the city to cool off after dark, is, quite literally, the single deadliest part of the entire phenomenon. Because here is the crucial thing about the human body: it can actually endure a genuinely brutal, scorching hot day surprisingly well, but only so long as it is then given a real chance to rest and to recover during a cooler night. But when that night never actually comes, when the temperature outside stubbornly stays up in the 80s or even the 90s, at 3 o'clock in the morning, then the body gets no relief at all and no chance whatsoever to recover. And so the heat stress just keeps right on accumulating and building hour after hour and day after day. And that, in the end, is exactly what finally pushes the most vulnerable people, the elderly and the sick and the very young, right past their breaking point. And this is not some abstract theory. In the very heat dome that is gripping America right now, as we speak, the forecasters have been warning over and over again that the single greatest danger of all is exactly this: the near total lack of any meaningful relief overnight. Next, let's consider what a city so conspicuously lacks, and that is greenery. Because out in the countryside, all of those plants and trees are actually functioning as natural, living air conditioners. Through the surfaces of their leaves, they are constantly releasing water vapor into the air, in a process that scientists call transpiration. And as all of that water evaporates, it cools the surrounding air right down, in the very same way that the evaporation of sweat cools down your own skin. And, on top of that, the trees also cast cool, deep shade, keeping the ground directly beneath them far cooler than it would otherwise be. But a city, with its endless acres of bare pavement and its chronic shortage of actual trees, loses very nearly all of this free, natural cooling. Strip out the greenery, in other words, and you have effectively stripped out the air conditioning. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely useful, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. And then, on top of all of that, there is the heat that a city actively generates entirely on its own. Because every single air conditioner that is humming away in a window is, by its very design, pumping heat out of a building and directly into the street outside. Every car engine, and every bus, and every factory, and every last one of the millions of warm human bodies packed into the place, is all throwing off its own waste heat, constantly. And so, on a hot day, a large city can genuinely generate a truly significant amount of its very own extra warmth, simply from all the vast machinery of modern life running at once. And here lies a genuinely cruel little irony, because as it gets hotter and hotter outside, people quite naturally crank their air conditioners up higher and higher. And those air conditioners cool the inside of the buildings precisely by dumping even more heat out into the already scorching streets, which of course only makes the outdoor heat island effect worse still. And finally, the very physical shape of a city itself works to trap the heat, because all of those tall buildings lining either side of those narrow streets actually form what are known as urban canyons. And these canyons block the wind, the very wind that might otherwise have carried some of the heat away. And their countless hard surfaces bounce the sunlight and the heat back and forth between one another, again and again, trapping it all down at street level rather than ever letting it escape upward into the open sky. So now, let's simply put all of it together. You have dark surfaces everywhere, greedily soaking up the sun. You have concrete and asphalt storing all of that heat and then radiating it right back out again all through the night. You have a near total loss of all the natural cooling that trees and plants would normally provide. You have a constant, relentless output of waste heat from all the machinery of the city. And you have a physical shape, all those urban canyons, that traps the whole lot of it in. And this is exactly why, when a great heat dome finally settles down over America, its cities do not merely get hot. They genuinely become ovens. But here, now, is something absolutely crucial to understand, and something genuinely troubling as well. This urban heat is very much not shared equally among the people living in it. Because within the boundaries of one single city, the actual temperature can vary enormously from one neighborhood to the very next, and it is very often the poorest neighborhoods of all that turn out to be the hottest ones. Study after study, conducted across American cities, has consistently found that the wealthier neighborhoods tend to have far more trees, and more parks, and more green space, and so as a direct result, they are significantly and measurably cooler. Meanwhile, the poorer neighborhoods tend to have far less tree cover, and much more bare pavement, and more concrete, and older, more crowded housing, very often with little or even no air conditioning at all. And the end result of all this is that within the very same city, and on the very same blazing hot day, a low-income neighborhood can be many whole degrees hotter than an affluent one. Sitting just a few short miles down the road, and in a great many American cities, this troubling pattern lines up disturbingly and almost perfectly with the old maps of racial segregation and of the discriminatory housing policies from many decades ago. The very same neighborhoods that were, historically, deliberately denied investment and green space are, today, very often the hottest and the most dangerous places to be in the middle of a severe heat wave. So extreme heat, much like so many other disasters, ends up falling the very hardest upon exactly those people who are the least able to protect themselves from it. And the stakes involved in all of this are genuinely and deadly serious, because heat is in actual fact the single number one weather-related killer in the entire United States, quietly killing more Americans in a typical year than hurricanes, and tornadoes, and floods, all combined together. And yet, precisely because heat tends to kill so invisibly and so undramatically an elderly person, dying all alone in a stifling, silent apartment rather than in some dramatic, photogenic, made-for-television disaster, it consistently receives only a tiny fraction of the public attention that it truly deserves. It is, in a very real and literal sense, a silent killer. And the urban heat island effect is the very thing that makes it quite so lethal. In precisely the crowded places where the great majority of us now actually live. To see just how deadly this can become, you need only look back to one of the most infamous heat disasters in American history, the Chicago heat wave of July 1995. Over the course of just a few searing days, a brutal heat wave settled over the city, and more than 700 people died. And when researchers later studied that catastrophe in detail, they found that it was very much a disease of the city and of isolation. The victims were overwhelmingly elderly and poor. Many of them lived alone in stifling top-floor apartments that never cooled down, in neighborhoods with little tree cover. Many were too afraid of crime to open their windows, or to sleep outside, or even to leave their homes for a cooling center. Some had no air conditioning, others could not afford to run the ones they had, and so they died, quietly and alone, in the sweltering dark, hundreds of them, in a single American city, in less than a week. The Chicago heat wave became a grim textbook example of exactly how the urban heat island, combined with social isolation and inequality, can turn a stretch of hot weather into a mass casualty event hiding in plain sight. So what then can actually be done about any of it? Well, the genuinely and wonderfully hopeful news is quite a lot, as it happens. Because once we truly understand exactly why our cities overheat in the first place, then we also, at the very same time, understand precisely how to go about cooling them back down again. And the single most powerful tool of them all is, quite simply, trees. Because planting more trees and steadily expanding the urban tree canopy, and especially doing so within those hottest and most underserved neighborhoods, provides both cooling shade and that natural evaporative cooling. And it can lower the local temperatures quite dramatically. Then there are so-called cool roofs, which can be as simple as painting the rooftops of buildings white, or using specially reflective materials so that the buildings bounce the sunlight away instead of greedily absorbing it, which can significantly cool both the building itself and the air all around it. And some cities are now even beginning to experiment with reflective, light-colored pavements for that very same reason. And then, of course, there are the immediate and the genuinely life-saving measures for a heat wave as it actually happens, opening up public cooling centers, where people who have no air conditioning of their own can go to escape the worst of the heat, checking in person, on elderly and vulnerable neighbors, and issuing clear and early and well-communicated warnings. And there is also now a real and growing push to begin taking extreme heat far more seriously at the very highest levels of government. Because right now, in the United States, extreme heat is still not officially classified as a major disaster, not in the same formal way that a hurricane or a flood automatically is, and that fact genuinely limits the federal resources that can be brought to bear against it. There is, at this very moment, a bipartisan effort underway in the United States Congress that is specifically aiming to change exactly that, to finally and formally recognize extreme heat as the truly deadly disaster that it really is. As of right now, it has not yet actually passed into law, but the very existence of that conversation reflects a slowly growing recognition that heat simply can no longer be treated as a mere summertime inconvenience. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, a bit of necessary perspective on the current event itself. Heat domes are, in and of themselves, a completely natural feature of summertime, and the United States has always experienced hot summers and severe heat waves throughout its entire history. What genuinely does appear to be changing, however, is their frequency and their sheer intensity, because a warming climate loads the dice toward more frequent and more severe and more stubbornly persistent heat events. And the remarkable string of successive heat domes this single summer does appear to fit squarely within that broader emerging pattern. But no single individual heat dome is, all by itself, simply caused by climate change. It is those steadily rising odds, and not any one event, that are the real and deeper story. Second, the urban heat island effect is itself not caused by climate change at all, not in the slightest. It is rather a simple physical consequence of the specific way that we have chosen to build our cities, out of concrete and asphalt, and it has existed for just as long as we have had large cities at all. What climate change actually does is take that pre-existing effect and make it far, far more dangerous by steadily raising the baseline temperature upon which the whole heat island then stacks. And third, and genuinely importantly, this is, at its heart, a real and a solvable problem. Because quite unlike so very many of the other great climate challenges we face, cooling down our cities is actually something that we very largely already know exactly how to do, with trees and with reflective surfaces, and with smarter design, and by deliberately protecting the most vulnerable among us. The heat is rising. Yes, that much is true. But we are very, very far indeed from being powerless against it. But the core message of that great heat dome now sitting over America is one that is genuinely well worth taking deeply to heart. Because as the whole world continues to warm, the real danger is no longer going to be measured merely in the single temperature number splashed across a national weather map. It is going to be measured, instead, block by block and street by street, right down in the very cities where most of humanity now actually lives, in which neighborhoods happen to have trees, and which have only bare baking concrete, in which homes happen to have working cooling, and which do not, and in whether or not the night ever actually brings any relief at all. The heat wave, in other words, is a great national story, but surviving it is always going to be an intensely and an unavoidably local one. So the very next time that a great heat dome parks itself directly over your own part of the country, and those heat warnings start to flash urgently across your screen, I want you to look just a little bit closer at the world immediately around you. Take a moment to notice the dark, shimmering asphalt of the road outside. Notice whether or not your particular street actually has any trees along it, or whether it sits bare and fully open to the beating sun. And notice how long after the sun has finally gone down, the heat still seems to radiate up, relentlessly, out of the pavement and the walls and the concrete all around you. Because that, right there, is the urban heat island, the quiet and the invisible, way that our own cities take the raw heat of a summer sky and then turn it up, higher and higher and higher, all around us. We built these great cities of ours for a cooler world than the one that is now, so clearly arriving, and so the great task of the coming years will be to carefully remake them, to plant all the trees, and to cool all the roofs, and to open the doors to every last one of those in need, so that when the next heat dome finally comes, and then the one after that, our cities might once again become true places of refuge from the heat, rather than the very ovens that trap it.